it's not about trying to adopt the perfect, quote unquote, perfect diet. I don't think that exists. You need to find your sweet spot, but there are changes that we can make if that's something that we're kind of interested in.
You went to nutritional school.
Mm-hmm.
Nutritionists are seen, generally speaking, as the authorities on nutrition, right? Is there anything in your research that you have now thought back to the things you learned in nutrition school and thought, no, that's not quite the case?
I get asked this all the time. I think people kind of have this idea that the nutrition schools are a long way behind the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure that I really had that experience. I think at least the course that I did, I think that by and large, the curriculum did reflect where the evidence is at today. And they do point to these major guidelines. I can't think of any kind of major examples where what I learned at university, I wouldn't kind of agree with now. And I think most people that are kind of in the nutrition science space and are objective, most people agree on about 90% of things. I know that we spend a lot of time thinking about, what do we disagree on? And I guess the algorithm kind of favors that. And maybe that's our human psyche wanting to focus on that. But, the chronic disease kind of situation that we're in right now, we don't need to know. It's not as if we don't have enough information from a nutrition point of view to really change that. It's not knowing what to do. It's doing what we know. And that's the difficult thing right now, is the implementation and the action at an individual level, but more importantly, at a community, societal level, to really, shift the needle here.
So when you write and present and create content and, host your podcast and do all things plant proof, who's your avatar? Who are you writing for?
Often think about my mom here. And my mom is, I think she's 67 this year. And for many years has been caught up in the nutrition confusion, has jumped from kind of diet to diet, is often, buying all sorts of crazy supplements, and is quite impressionable and sort of, just takes everything at face value, and is very confused. I think she's very confused because over the years, she's been exposed to so many people with so many different nutrition philosophies. She has now come full circle so many times and just isn't really confident. So I think about her as one of the avatars, and I just use that word confident. What I am aiming to do is not tell people how to eat at all, but give them some information and some tools so that they can be more confident in a world where it is hard to be confident with our food choices. It's easy to start doubting ourselves. Are we doing the right thing? And, there are actually many different kind of dietary labels or dietary patterns that can bring great health. And I'm of the view that it's the kind of broad characteristics or overall theme that matters. We can get kind of reeled into these different dietary labels, and it can become very, very tribal. But in reality, when you do look objectively at nutrition science, it's not that there is one particular dietary label that hands down is the best. What we do see very consistently, though, is that dietary patterns where people have better health for longer, there are some common characteristics. And what I like to kind of put forward for folks is to help, shine a light on those characteristics. And then people can pick and choose and find a variation of that theme that works best for them, that they feel best on, that they can sustain for the long term, because in this nutrition conversation, there's a lot of approaches out there that I think are not sustainable for the individual. And we forget that there's no real value of someone adopting a particular diet and then giving it up in 2 weeks. What I think most of us want for folks is to find a healthy dietary pattern that they can stick to for the long term. That's going to have the most effect on their health. That's going to reduce their risk the most of cardiovascular disease, of various types of cancer, of dementia, etc.
Yeah, I like this idea of instead of looking for the exceptions, like the whole, my grandmother smoked her whole life. She lived to be 95 years old or whatever, which you have in your book. Instead of focusing on that, which I think a lot of us go to kind of justify whatever it is that we're doing in quotes moderation, just looking at the different small things that we could all be doing just to get in better health, just drinking more water and adding a couple more varieties of plants to whatever it is you're eating, and maybe cutting sugar in half, and these kinds of things. And then there are different levels of veganism, right? You may start off as a dirty vegan, eating the fake meats and stuff, and then you kind of graduate from that and you start eating more salads and whatnot. And then eventually you get to the point where you start eating it because you care about the planet and you care about planetary health. And, so you start doing more research. What was your, talk to us about your progression in veganism. How did it go? And compared to what you see now?
And let me just comment on the grandmother bit that you mentioned there, because I get that a lot as well. Yeah, of
course.
It's funny that comes up, and I get it. And I always say that, the grandmother who's 93 and smokes and drinks alcohol, it's not as though that the data we have doesn't explain that. She's there. She's just an outlier. And if you look at the bell curve, she's accounted for. We know she's there. So it's possible, but it's just not probable. So you can kind of, ask yourself, do you want to kind of run the gauntlet and hope that you're an outlier? Or do you want to try and make some small changes, as you say, and shift things in your favor in case you're not one of these outliers? My journey, it definitely started with health. And I was able to kind of quite quickly identify that diets that are rich in plant protein, rich in fiber, that are low in saturated fat, and very low in ultra processed foods, a lot of those foods with added sugar you just mentioned before. Diets that are kind of ticking those boxes are the ones that really are time and time again shown to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, which was kind of my on-ramp through my dad's experience. That's what I was most interested in. And there are really a number of reasons as to how eating in that way does reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease by improving cholesterol and improving blood pressure and inflammation and other risk factors. And so that was kind of the initial sort of on-ramp. And over the years, I think I started to become more and more interested in planetary health as well, in particular. And I think that was because that's another area where there is a lot of science. And again, a lot of different views out there. So I interviewed, a bunch of different environmental scientists over the years on my show, and have gone myself into the literature. And, it's really interesting that today, I think 50% of all habitable land is agriculture. And if you think about that, we've kind of turned Earth into a giant farm. And this is really important because, the climate is certainly changing. There's no denying that. I think people may argue over what's causing it. But we do know that one of the the biggest areas where humans are impacting the climate is through agriculture. And what that means is through how we produce food. We have 7-8 billion people. We will shortly have 9 to 10 that we need to feed calories, and these calories do come at the expense of the health of our environment. There are greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of these calories. There's biodiversity loss. There's water loss. And all of this also affects food security. How many calories do we have to go around? And of that 50% of land that we're currently using for agriculture, the staggering statistic is that 83% of that is for animal agriculture. So 83% of all the land we use to produce food is for animal agriculture. But that only produces 18% of our calories. So we have enormous swaths of land devoted to this form of agriculture that is very inefficient. And so the reason why that's very important is because one of the kind of most powerful ways that we can help keep our climate cooler and meet some of these climate targets is by drawing down more carbon. And the most powerful way from a land point of view is to return a lot of this land to natural ecosystems, rewilding, reforesting. And it requires a bit of a mindset shift, as opposed to kind of looking at all land as land for agriculture and what can we extract from it. It's a mindset shift. And if you look at the IPCC report or the Eat Lancet, all of these major reports, you'll see that they're all recommending shifts to plant-rich diets. And the reason for that is not just because plant foods are responsible for significantly less greenhouse gas emissions when you produce them on a per calorie or per gram protein basis, but because it uses less land and we can free up all of this land. In fact, there's been a calculation suggesting that if the world was to shift to very plant-rich diets like the Eat Lancet diet, which is not a plant exclusive, there's still animal foods in there, but it's less, we could free up land the size of the African continent that could be rewilded and drawing down carbon and improving biodiversity. So this is very much a land use conversation. What we're talking about when you hear people saying we need to shift to more plant-based, plant-rich diets from a food perspective to improve planetary health, what we're talking about here is removing or reducing the amount of land that we're using to produce our calories. And, so over the years, that's become a kind of a passion of mine and something that I've spoken about. I speak about it in the book, and I go through a lot of these different statistics. And you don't have to change your diet to a plant-exclusive diet to be a part of the solution. In the book, I write about what I think Mark Bittman calls a 2/3 vegan diet, which is I changed that to plant-based before 6 p.m. And essentially that's eating plant-based for breakfast and lunch, and having some animal protein with dinner. And that style diet dramatically reduces greenhouse gas emissions from your plate. So again, it's not about trying to adopt the perfect, quote unquote, perfect diet. I don't think that exists. You need to find your sweet spot, but there are changes that we can make if that's something that we're kind of interested in.
I love that mission of rewilding the size of land on the planet That's as big as the continent of Africa. When you think about that, right? Like that's definitely a mission that's bigger than you. Probably won't happen in this lifetime. Maybe not for the next couple of lifetimes. How do you actually see that happening with considering politics, capitalism, people's preferences, diet being as strong as religion? Like how walk us through your, not that you have all the answers, but just whatever you've envisioned. How do you kind of see it happening? How are people going to be inspired to do this? Through a movie, through
I think there
stories?
needs to be, yeah. I mean, movies and stories are great, but I do think there needs to be a top down approach here as well, where
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be incentives. If I'm a farmer right now and I have cattle on my land, and I've inherited this farm from my parents who worked very hard to build this farm up. I have a family and it's my livelihood. If I'm going to rewild this land, I want to be incentivized. I need to make more money through the carbon drawdown and putting plants back on the farm and reducing my cattle. I need to make more money from that than I am from selling cattle. So there's an economic commercial element to this, right? You're not going to see people, let's be realistic, with huge farms where they have massive mortgages, families. You're not going to see them just
Do the right thing just to save the planet.
yeah. And I would argue that is it even the right, like, even just contemplating, is it the right thing, is like an interesting thing to contemplate from their perspective
Mm-hmm.
of,
Right.
they have their family that relies on them and they have all of this debt. Many would probably argue the right thing is to keep their business operating, or they end up bankrupt. So that's tough, right? And I think that often this conversation gets to a point like where farmers are made out to be the bad guys. But if you just think about that and appreciate that for the moment, unless that the farmer is given a way to go down another path where they can make just as much income or more, well, their hands are really tied. So there does have to be big top-down changes to help facilitate a change in the system. And the change in the system being moving from agriculture that uses 50% of habitable land to an agriculture system that has a much smaller footprint. And if we're going to do that, we need more people eating more calories directly from whole plants. There can still be some animal foods, but rather than being the hero of the plate, they're going to be more of a side, a smaller component. And I think that there are a number of challenges in doing that. We'd be fooling ourselves. We're talking about food. Most governments have not wanted to talk about food for a long time because you have to be an incredibly brave government to try and tell people how to eat. It's a good way to get yourself voted out. So, it's going to take some real political will to kind of come in and say, hey, here is our vision. We understand how important agriculture is to climate change. Now, we don't want anyone to kind of go bankrupt, or we don't want our farmers. We don't want to let our farmers down. So we've come up with solutions to help them transition. This is what it's going to mean for them. This is what it's going to mean for American diets or Australian diets. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but we're close. And the latest IPCC report again reiterates we're running out of time here. So I think it will get to a point where governments really don't have an option, and they do need to kind of step in and start to navigate the diet space a little bit more.
Who do you think is going to lead this charge? Certainly not the US.
I think it's a lot of the countries like Norway and Eastern European kind of countries, and some of them are already doing things. The Danish dietary guidelines are very, very environmentally friendly. Health Canada, believe it or not, their dietary guidelines that came out in 2019 or 2020, and their guidelines are obviously for human health, but for the first time they mentioned planetary health and the importance of sustainability and the fact that human health relies on planetary health. So it's starting to happen, and in their guidelines they say choose plant protein where possible. That's also in the American Heart Association guidelines last year. They say to choose plant protein where possible. And they're saying that, again, from a human health point of view, there are a lot of different studies showing that when you're eating more legumes, for example, over red meat, there are some benefits up for grabs. But also from an environmental perspective. So I think the governments that lead it will probably be out of Europe. And, we're starting to see guidelines changing. There's not a whole lot of conversation happening in Australia. So I'm not super proud of that, but the next 5 years are going to be very, very interesting.
Well, one thing you mentioned in your book that I think is a concern for a lot of people, especially nowadays, especially having gone through the whole pandemic conspiracy theories and just that way of thinking. And you mentioned how, in the last, I guess, 15 years or so, chocolate is now seen as healthy. Red wine, is this health drink. And you expose that that's not the full story, because a lot of it is being funded by these big corporations that don't give a crap about our health. They just want to sell more products. So how do we see through that when we hear all these recommendations?
I think the guidelines are very good at kind of looking at industry funding, and they're getting better. So, for example, those Health Canada guidelines that I just mentioned, they actually came out, and you can look at this online. They came out on record and said, this is the first time that we are not being influenced by industry in the creation of these guidelines. And coincidentally, and I don't think dairy is poison. I don't take that position that some people do within the vegan space. I have a more nuanced approach to dairy, but coincidentally, this was the first time that Health Canada removed dairy as an essential food group, having kind of taken that position. So I think that the committees that are doing these guidelines are aware of industry research, and they're also aware of the fact that not all industry-funded research is bad. If we didn't have industry funding any science, we'd actually have far less science to work with. So when I say something is industry funded, it increases my level of skepticism. But then I'm looking through that study to understand, well, what did they compare to? How did they define this population? Is there anything here to be worried about? And if I get to the end of that paper and it all reads well and looks good, then I'm no longer going to just discard that study because, it's industry funded. So that's kind of my approach to kind of reviewing science in general. Once I go through the methodology and that all checks out, then I'm not so concerned if it was industry funded or not. And so I think, there's no real short answer to this other than, yes, industry funds studies. Often they set up the study in terms of the design to make their food or product look favorable. Again, could be comparing it to a dummy diet, or there are a number of things that they could do in the design so that the conclusion looks favorable. But usually you can spot that. If you look through the trial, or scientists can usually spot that. Now, the unfortunate thing here, Light, is that the media do not do that. They don't go into
I was going to say, it's a great
methodology.
headline to say wine is great for you.
Exactly.
That'll sell a lot of magazines, especially if in a wine magazine.
Yeah, I think there's a compound in wine, resveratrol. Not I think there is. What I think is that it's been reported that this is a bit of a longevity compound and has all of these fabulous effects. But I can't remember the exact amount, but in order to get enough of that compound, you'd have to drink like 20 or 30 liters of wine. And that's not always in the article when people write about red wine. So you're right. The headline, and this is one of the big challenges that we face, is that the headlines love absolutes. They love more extreme positions. And science is not absolute, it's more nuanced. But can you imagine if a headline included the nuance? It would probably be fairly boring, unappealing, and wouldn't drive clicks. And this then flows through to social media. If you look at accounts that take more absolute extreme positions, you'll see often they're huge. And when they do their posts, if you look at their engagement, it's huge. The algorithm favors these very extreme absolute positions. And that's why people double down on them, because that position works. It gets one side who finds that an appealing message. You've reinforced their identity. You have reinforced their identity. So they love that message. And then on the other side of the fence, it triggers those people, and the comments go off. The algorithm picks this up, and it reaches more people. So, unfortunately, as the current landscape is set up, both in mainstream media and on social media, the more nuanced kind of explanation is usually almost always getting less attention.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the individual, right? So someone hears this conversation, and maybe they eat relatively, when their mind healthy, I eat grass-fed, whatever, or I eat plant-based, whatever. How can someone verify whether or not their particular diet is effective? What are some of the markers? What kind of tests or labs can they get to show them if it's effective?
So you can do a basic lab test, which will come back with your vitamin and mineral status for most of the major vitamins and minerals. So that's a kind of good first step. And often that will include a basic lipid panel. The lipid panel is really giving you a kind of window into your cardiovascular health and your risk of having a heart attack or even a stroke. And these are really important to look at, even if you're, say, 20 light, because these diseases they're not something that just happens overnight. You might have a heart attack when you're 40 or when you're 50 or when you're 60, but they actually have a long latency period. And what that means is that the pathology is brewing under the surface for a long time. So the earlier you can start to look at this objective information and then make changes, the lower your lifetime risk of having one of these events will be. So the lipid test is going to show you things like total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, your what they call non-HDL cholesterol, and a bunch of other things. The most important thing to look at there is non-HDL cholesterol. And we could go right into the weeds on this, so I'll try and keep it surface level here. But what we know is atherosclerosis, which is the most common cause of cardiovascular disease, and is essentially a scientific word that describes plaque. Imagine your arteries and you have plaque, fatty plaque building up. That's what we call atherosclerosis. This relies on atherogenic lipoproteins, and I'm going to break down what that means, because that probably sounds like a lot of jargon. We have fats that travel in our blood, like the fats that we eat, and also the cholesterol that our liver makes. And in order for these to travel through the blood, they're not actually water soluble. So they have to be carried by something. A little bit like light, if you think about when we ship stuff around the world in a shipping container, we have to put those containers onto a big cargo boat, right? And so you can imagine that all of those containers on the top, that's your cholesterol and fats, right? And the ship is a protein. The protein is carrying the fats and the cholesterol on top of it. Now, some of these ships, if they bump into, as they're going through the ocean, if they bump into, let's call it the dock, but in our body's case, we're talking about the wall of our artery. If they bump into the artery, instead of just deflecting off, they actually enter the dock and become lodged. They become stuck. And so if that becomes retained or stuck in the artery wall, as you can imagine, the fat, the cholesterol that's on top of it can start to build up. And that's how you develop these plaques. And the reason that is problematic is because your arteries are very important for transporting oxygenated blood to our organs. And as this plaque is building up and up, it can obstruct blood flow. It can reduce the blood flow to your heart, or in the case of a stroke, to your brain. Okay. I said before, non-HDL is the most important thing to look at on that blood test. The reason for that is that number, that non-HDL number, essentially accounts for all of these proteins in your blood that have the capacity to cross into the artery and get stuck. That's what it's looking at. So when you look at the non-HDL number, you want to see, because usually there's a reference range there, and I won't do the conversions because America is different to Australia and whatnot. But the important thing is to look at that non-HDL number and see that it is within the healthy reference range. There's a better test now that's available that you can request. In some areas, you'll have to pay for it, though it won't be part of the standard kind of Medicare covered test. And this test is called ApoB. This is the gold standard to see the number of atherogenic lipoproteins directly in your blood, the concentration of them. And to give you an idea, you want that figure at about 70 to 80 milligrams per deciliter or lower. When you get down to that level, people are not, and that's the level someone's had over their entire life, you do not see atherosclerosis. Now, the average person getting around in Australia or in America today, their ApoB is more at around 120. So considerably higher. Now, you may be thinking, well, okay, if I get that test and it's high, what can I do? So this would be a discussion to have with your physician, and it would depend on how high it was. If it wasn't considered to be a genetic, because there are some genes in certain cases that can cause elevated ApoB, and you would know that by perhaps someone else in your family has this, or it's always been elevated your entire life. And you can see that on previous tests. This is how you would identify that. But if we were thinking about diet, what can you do from a diet point of view to lower that figure? The key things are to eat less saturated fat, to eat more polyunsaturated fats, because they lower that number, and to eat more fiber, because fiber lowers that number. And so what does that look like overall? This is why I'm a proponent of plant predominant diets, because as you start to reduce your emphasis on meats, particularly the fattier cuts of meats, but even the lean meats, lean red meat and lean white meat, as you start to eat less of those and you eat more plant protein, but more seafood as well. Fatty fish is good. Nuts and seeds and avocado. And you might be thinking that what I'm describing is a little bit more of like a Mediterranean style diet.
Mm-hmm.
As you start to make those shifts, you see the dietary pattern has less saturated fat naturally. It has more polyunsaturated fats, which are found in fish and in nuts and seeds. And it has more fiber. And all of those coalesce to drive that ApoB number down to reduce the amount of atherogenic lipoproteins in your blood. That's why we see those dietary patterns reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's one important test that I would say. Over and kind of above that, I don't think the average person needs to go and do anything else more fancy than all of that. So what you're doing is you're making sure that your vitamin and mineral, your nutrient status is good. Of course, if something was low, you would then work through diet or supplement to correct that. And you're looking at your lipid panel and making sure that that's putting you at a level where you're going to be at very low risk of having a cardiovascular event. And the earlier, the better. That's why I want people to test this stuff, in their teens, 20s, preferably. But then, even if you're 40, 50 now and you haven't been keeping an eye on it, get to it now, because it's going to be much better that you get a hop onto this now as opposed to looking at it when you're 70 or 80. Other than that, I don't think there is too much else that people need to test. If someone comes back and of course their physician sees their lipids are really not great, and perhaps they have a personal history of cardiovascular disease or their family does, they may order extra tests like a coronary artery calcium scan, for example. There are further diagnostics that people can do to kind of determine that person's risk of having an event, and also whether they can improve their lipids through diet alone and lifestyle, or whether they also need some form of pharmaceutical intervention as well.
And if someone does have numbers that are a little bit concerning and they want to take the next step, right? Obviously, getting your book is a good point of reference, but if they want someone to actually consult them, because a lot of times, they talk about how doctors don't have a whole lot of nutritional training, so maybe you should take their dietary advice with a grain of salt. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but what do you recommend? Should they hire a nutritionist? Is there a resource that you're aware of that people can reach out to and get some coaching or mentorship in that regard?
I think most registered dietitians, if we're talking about here about a diet as the kind of intervention and what someone's interested in getting some advice on, I would be going to see a registered dietitian over a physician for specific nutrition information. But your physician could well and probably should be part of that overall conversation. You're looking at you're seeing the physician more for your kind of primary point of contact. They're going to look at all your lab tests, and then you would go and work with a dietitian specifically on the diet component. But again, then you may 3 months down the track go back to your physician, explain the changes you've made with your diet. They might review your medications. They might order more labs so you can see the changes, objectively see, okay, I've tweaked these things in my diet with the dietitian, and these are the changes that I've made. I can share you a few links and resources that could help people find a dietitian that they could work with.
Beautiful. So when I published my the book before the last one that we talked about on your podcast, which is Bliss More, How to Succeed in Meditation Without Really Trying, one of the things that I would say that made my book unique amongst all the other meditation books is that it was actually written by someone who is teaching meditation to regular people on the front lines, as opposed to someone who's just a marketing person or an internet guru or self-help person or a doctor, none of which actually works with people day to day teaching them meditation, right? What would you say is unique about your book compared to all of the other plant exclusive books that are out there in the market?
Well, I guess firstly that it's not plant exclusive. So that would be one of the main things, I guess, and my overall approach in terms of not being afraid of the gray and the nuance. You're not going to see absolutes in there, and I really want people to, in the book I define plant based, and we didn't do that this episode, but plant based does not mean plant exclusive. I think sometimes people see my book and assume it's a vegan book. It's not a vegan book. I want people to look at the science that I put forward and the information and adapt to this way of plant-based eating that works for them, right? So first and foremost, you won't see hyperbole or exaggerations of the science. I'm simply showing the science, the most up-to-date cutting edge science that we have today, right. and want you to kind of understand that and understand why confusion exists. So rather than just telling you do this, I explore topics and explore why there are different views and try and give you the information that leaves you feeling confident. So next time you see a headline about eggs or about red meat or about vegan diets, you go, yes, I understand. I read that in Simon's book, and I'm not going to be derailed by this headline. So in many ways, I wrote the book almost, and clearly I don't want to talk about vaccines, they're obviously very controversial, but in a different kind of way, I see the book almost as a vaccine to kind of immunize people against misinformation. And so I'm well aware that there are misinformation in all camps. There's misinformation in the very, very meat diet camps. There's misinformation in the vegan camp. And I wrote the book to kind of try and clear up a lot of that, provide a kind of objective, nuanced voice. And, my publisher told me that people want the simplified message and don't want the detailed nuance. And I fought for that because I disagree. I think today, I know from my podcast, the listeners are so intelligent and people want more information. And so, you're not going to open it and it's not going to be a book where I'm assuming the reader is not intelligent. I'm assuming the reader is intelligent, and I'm giving you quite a bit of information, but I know that you'll be able to make sense of it.
How would you articulate your personal mission these days?
That's a great question. This kind of does change a little bit from time to time. I think my personal mission is to give people a greater appreciation of science. And I know that sounds very broad, but I think science has, at least over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of question marks about it. And coming back to what we started on, I think that some people have lost trust in science and faith. And there are some very valid reasons. I understand where they're coming from. We touched on industry funded research, and I can understand how someone may have lost faith in science. But I want to kind of help people appreciate that science is, while it's not perfect, it is the best method we have for objectively testing our hypotheses and intuition. And while there are, a number of areas where science needs to improve, and I want to be, fighting for that, we don't need to, throw it out, as I see certain people, kind of proposing that science is not the way forward. So through these nuanced discussions and and getting into some of the deeper stuff, my aim is to kind of rebuild some of that trust in science, particularly in nutrition science. You know, the science kind of community, I guess if you look at the last 100 years, in the early 1900s, the diseases of the day were like scurvy and beriberi, and pellagra, these kind of nutrient deficiency diseases. And then as the century kind of progressed, those diseases, they kind of started to fade away in developed countries because nutrition science identified the key vitamins that were important, and we were able to manage those. But the diseases of the day changed to these non-communicable chronic diseases. And there are many people out there that I see online who suggest that the last 70 years of nutrition science has been a failure. If you look at the rates of disease, it would be easy for someone. I can see how someone would say, well, if we've been studying nutrition for 70, 80 years, looking at its effect on cardiovascular disease and various cancers, why are the rates of these diseases, still going up? And I mentioned earlier, it's not a case of needing to know more. Our problem and the reason why we're seeing these rates of disease go up is our failure to implement and to get action. And if you currently look at the dietary guidelines today, like less than 5% of people are following them. And it's not the individual that I'm blaming here. Our societies are just not set up in a way that makes it easy to follow them. And that's why 60% of the calories are coming from ultra processed foods. So where I'm getting at with all of this is that I want people to see science as I see it. It is to be appreciated, to be loved. It's very, very important for our societies. It's not without its failures, but I think it is key, central to making this world better for us and for future humans.
So you grew up sort of surrounded by scientific research. So talk about that, your earliest experiences and your dad and his influence on your future.
Yeah, I was kind of born into this environment of science, and so I really had no choice. It was, I think my fate in many ways was decided for me by my dad's career choice and his passion. At least it largely influenced me in terms of where I ended up. But, I would get picked up by my dad at school and jump into the car, and there'd be a pile full of scientific papers on the seat. And I can vividly remember some of my earliest memories just having to shift these papers out of the way literally every time. They'd be piled just on the seat or coming out of his briefcase, overflowing. And he would have scribbled on them and highlighted bits and pieces, and I'd shift them to the ground. And he drove a very small car, an MGB, and somehow I'd fit in there with my backpack in the sandwiched between these papers in the kind of leg space. And then we'd get home and there'd be more of these scientific papers all around the house, the kitchen, the living room, his study. In many ways, he turned the whole house into his study, I think. It seemed that way with all these papers. And I had no idea what these scientific papers were saying. I could barely even make sense of the English language at that time. I was still trying to kind of perfect that. And
right.
But what I knew was that these were very important to my dad. And I would spend weekends going into the universities that he was working at. My dad's a professor in physiology. And he would walk around in his white lab coat with his colleagues, and I would see them on the microscopes, and I'd jump up and have a go looking down the microscopes into these kind of petri dishes. And again, all that I kind of understood at that time was that science is really important, and it's this method that we have for objectively better understanding the world that we live in. And by doing that, we can reduce some uncertainty and then hopefully make better decisions in our lives. And, so I
So I
kind
have a
of,
quick question. When you were a kid, right, and your dad's a scientist. So my dad was an attorney. So a lot of times the conversation would be such that, the way he would speak as an attorney, he would speak in arguments, and you would have to defend yourself and all of that. So as a kid, what did you learn growing up with a scientist? Like, what is that conversation like? Was there a scientific method to everything in your house, even like schoolwork and stuff like that?
Well, there was a little bit of, my dad would always challenge me and say why. So if I was thinking something or saying something, and that's a very scientific thing to do, if you just say something, to then sort of inquire, well, why is that? And so I could really understand his kind of curious mind that he had and how that translated into the way that he saw the world, for sure. And I kind of over time as a child started to develop a real appreciation for science and for that curiosity. I didn't know where I would personally end up, but I did gravitate through my studies towards this field of science.
My dad told my brothers and I, whatever you do, don't become an attorney. I don't know why he said that, but I don't know if he necessarily saw it as his passion and purpose. What were some of the ideologies or philosophies that you remember your dad telling you when you were a kid, or you and your brother?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's making me think quite deeply here. I think that when it came to at least his work, it was that we can use the scientific method to basically test our intuition. So as humans, we have intuition and we have hypotheses, and we can use this method of science in a very objective form to kind of test those things, test them out. And we can either falsify them, or we can move towards a position where we believe that hypothesis is actually accurate. So for me, I'm not sure if I fully understood or answered your question there, but and it was also he taught my brother and I not to think in black and white thinking. And that was really, really big for us. And he would always say, not all science is equal. And I can remember that. And it's something I wrote in my book. And what he means by that is that there are very, different forms of scientific investigations. There are different methods. There are, a range of different studies that qualify as science, but we need to understand which ones are more reliable, which ones are more valid, which ones are hypothesis generating, and which ones should we use for, say, public health recommendations. And being able to kind of appreciate the gray and the uncertainty, and then be able to zoom out from any one individual piece of science and look at the totality of evidence. So if you just are looking at one little piece of the puzzle and you've zoomed in, really, really far, if you're just looking at that piece, you'll fail to see the entire picture of that puzzle. And so, appreciating the uncertainty, getting comfortable with the gray, understanding that everything is not black and white, and not getting so reductionist that you're unable to kind of zoom back out and see everything from, a much kind of broader view.
And he was studying the heart, right? Heart health. That was his area of research.
Yeah, so he's been researching how our arteries function. And his particular research is interested in vascular stiffness, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And so he's basically a very deep scientist working under the microscope, trying to understand mechanisms, which are important. I see sometimes online. I think that research can be kind of over extrapolated, because not everything that happens in a petri dish or at the level of an animal translates to a human. And I think people get a bit tripped up here, because often I say that, and they might think that I'm saying that science is not good. My dad has performed that science throughout his entire career. I'm not saying that it's not good. It's much needed, but it is hypothesis generating. So when you have findings at that level of science, you then need to test them at higher, more rigorous, more valid levels of science, particularly in humans, in order to kind of strengthen that hypothesis and understand that what you're seeing in that kind of petri dish environment is actually translating across to human physiology.
So when you were when you were 13, 14, 15, did you consider your dad to be a healthy person? Because I know a lot of Aussies, not everyone, but a lot of them are very health conscious. I see people running, and when I'm there, everyone's always exercising or playing rugby or doing something. What was this? And he was only in his 40s, early 40s when you were a teenager. So was he healthy in your eyes?
Yeah, definitely. I would go to the YMCA with my dad, and I would kind of watch him work out. He plays squash as well. So he was playing squash 2-3 times a week. He would do some strength workouts. He was at that stage, a very hardworking academic with 2 young children. So he wasn't an elite athlete. He didn't really have the time, I think, to kind of to put in those hours. But I think if you looked at him, you wouldn't look at him and say he was unhealthy. You would look at him and say he's a typical representation of an early 40s Australian father who is doing some leisure, some physical exercise, without being a kind of elite athlete. So, I think where you're probably going with this is my dad. He experienced a severe heart attack, and that was in front of me. I was the only one with him, and this was the first time that I really saw what loss of health looks like in an acute manner. And I think up until that time, for my first 15 years of life, I kind of just thought that our health was guaranteed. I know that sounds very naive, but I just hadn't seen anyone close to me go through any sort of ill health. And so my dad had this heart attack in front of me. And initially, he went through some stages of denial for a couple of hours there, and then it got too severe, whereby we had to call the ambulance, and they actually sent a helicopter. We were quite remote. We were in a country area in Victoria, and they flew him to hospital, and all of that's happening at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and there's a lot to kind of digest as a kid. As we just mentioned, my dad from the outside appeared very, very healthy. So this is going down. There's paramedics, there's oxygen, they've got him hooked up to cables to check his pulse. And it was very frightening, because it seemed to come from nowhere. It was so unexpected. They got him to the hospital, and they saved his life. And that was what I was most concerned with, and my brother and mother were most concerned with. But thinking back on that now, I really appreciate how lucky he was, because that's not the case for so many people. So many people die of sudden cardiac death. And so a combination of good fortune, of incredible healthcare access and privilege, have resulted in my dad getting a second chance. And I think part of that is what inspires me today with what I do, and why I wrote the book, so that I can hopefully get some of this information to people before they experience something like my father did, and not have to kind of run the gauntlet there, and hope for a second chance. But that period for me, it, although I didn't realize it at the time, it did plant that seed, which would then go, later kind of fuel me to progress my studies and write the book. But what one thing at that time that really did stick in my mind was, we had a kind of family consultation with the cardiologist, a bit of a debrief. This is what's gone down. Here's your dad's prognosis. Here's what his health could look like from here. And all of that, we were very relieved. As I say, we were just happy that he was alive. But the cardiologist did say to my brother and I that, your dad's had a heart attack at 41, which is very young. Your grandfather had a heart attack in his early 60s. So, you and your brother, my brother's 3 years older than I, you're pretty much young men. You need to keep an eye on this, because cardiovascular disease runs in families. And the conversation kind of ended there, and, well, not kind of, it did end there. And so for a long while, my brother and I, our kind of takeaway from that was that we had been dealt a sort of bad genetic card, and that we need to keep an eye on this, and that, who knows, we may end up in the same position as dad in our early 40s.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you wanted to go to medical school, but you changed your mind at the last minute. So walk us through the next few years after high school, knowing that you were on a collision course with some sort of heart problem genetically, and not feeling like you had many options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think I want to kind of clarify that although I had that mindset, I was living life to the fullest, perhaps because I thought that, hey, anything can happen. So it wasn't like it was getting me down, and I wasn't enjoying life. In fact, it was probably the opposite. And you're right, you've done your research. I wanted to go to med school. I didn't quite get the marks to go to the medical school in Melbourne, and at University of Melbourne. And I had the decision to go down and do medical school in Tasmania, which I've since gone and traveled, and is a beautiful place. But at the time, I wanted to keep playing football. I had a lot of friends in Melbourne. I wasn't really wanting to give up the kind of the social side of things. It wasn't that appealing for me. So I switched direction, undertook a Bachelor of Science degree in physiotherapy, and progressed through that, and started working as a sports physiotherapist in private practice and with elite footballers in Melbourne. And then, eventually, some years later, I realized that I had a pretty good understanding of physiology and anatomy, and a lot of understanding about managing sports injuries and rehabilitation. But I did have this real curiosity for nutrition, particularly having come across some information that suggested our nutrition, the way we eat, can really affect our risk of cardiovascular disease. And that inspired me to go back to university, and I did a master's in nutrition science at Deakin University.
And that was after you had your experience with your brother, right?
That's right. Yeah. So he was basically that little bit of kind of information that opened my eyes to, hey, I'm feeling really healthy right now, but given my family history, maybe there's something here that I should look at a little more deeply. And so he kind of, my brother planted the seed. We can go into that story if you want.
Yeah, let's go into the story.
Yeah.
I would love that.
So this is kind of what opened my eyes to how confusing nutrition is. and is what inspired me
Mm.
to then go and say, hey, I actually want to go and study this in detail so I can actually decode it, because it seems like another language and it's so confusing with, people online with, seemingly the same qualifications, but coming at this from very different angles. And so the story is, I was living in Sydney at this time. My brother was coming to visit with his fiance to stay for a week or 2 weeks, I think it was. And he called me up. I think the first time was about 3 months beforehand, and he said, "Look, I just want to give you the heads up that Lauren and I have changed the way that we're eating." And I said, "Okay," and he said, "Yeah, we're no longer eating red meat or chicken. We're still eating fish. We're eating a sort of pescatarian style diet." And I thought, okay, well, that's fine. And I think he was giving me the heads up just so that, shopping and the restaurants we would go to would accommodate for that. Not that that's very difficult to accommodate for. And then, I didn't hear from him for a little while. And then about a week before he came, he called me back up and said, "Look, I just want to give you a bit more of an update where we've actually changed the way we're eating again. We're no longer eating fish." And at that stage, I was saying, well, what's left? Animal protein for me, like, was a very, very big part of my diet, a huge part. I think that was a result of the kind of fitness industry and the football sort of environment I was in at the time. And so he kind of explained to me that they'd stopped eating seafood. And
Mhm.
I said, okay, well, I'm not sure where we're going to eat, if we're going to go out to any restaurants. So I'll leave that to you. And when you get up, we can go to the grocery store and you can help me. And to be honest, they came up and it wasn't really a big deal. They love to cook. They cooked a lot of great food. We had a really good time. I think we went out to a couple of restaurants that they chose. And other than sort of my brother just saying that he was making these decisions for his cardiovascular health primarily, and sending me a couple of links to a few kind of podcasts. Other than that, I just really enjoyed the food, and I think it took some weeks after that for me to kind of muster up the energy and kind of get some space and think to myself, well, hey, maybe there is something to this. But also remember back to what I was saying about my dad. I'm not sure if I added this when you asked about some of his influences on us. Being skeptical is something that my dad has reiterated to us, for as long as I can recall. And I was very skeptical of what my brother, what he was kind of sending to me. And I was kind of, wearing this hat of, hey, I've done a bachelor of science. I'm gonna take a deep dive and I'll let you know what I think of it. And in some ways, I wanted to kind of prove my brother wrong, because my diet at that time, which was very rich in animal protein, particularly red meat and chicken, it felt like it was serving me quite well. I felt fit and healthy. So I had no real reason to kind of change that.
Had he, who got him into it? Did Lauren watch like Forks Over Knives and say, honey, you have to watch this? And then they watched it together, type of a thing?
No, I think he had actually come across a couple of podcasts where folks like Rich Roll were getting interviewed, and then they'd
Mhm.
listen to Rich's audio book. But my brother, he comes from a marketing kind of sales background. He wasn't doing a deep dive into the science. He had, you know, been sent a bit of information about people that had made the transition to change their diet, and also some information around various populations that were living long, healthy lives without some of the diseases that we have, and what their kind of dietary habits looked like. But so at that level, at that stage, this was I guess very surface level kind of information.
Right, but you guys grew up in the same house, so you both were
Mm-hmm.
exposed to this whole skepticism
Mm-hmm.
influence. So did he know how to approach you with this information? Like Simon is not into the hard sell, or Simon needs to hear scientific evidence, or Simon is appeal to his physique, or did he kind of, how did he lure you into the club?
Well, I mean, during that week, certainly he wasn't like
I'm just
sending me.
asking because I have three
Yeah,
brothers, and I was vegan for a long time, and none of them, I couldn't get anybody
yeah.
to eat like that. So I'm
No,
just
it's
curious
an
what the
interesting thing
secret
to kind
formula
of
is.
to think back on, and I haven't really asked him too much about that. But if I was to kind of just think back to that period, he certainly was not sending me scientific studies. He just shared a couple of things that he'd listened to, and they cooked good food, and we went to restaurants that served good food. Um, I think you kind of have to remember my brother going through high school and into university, his interest was never really in science, and mine was. So kind of in our relationship, he has his skill sets in another area to mine. So I think when it came to this kind of area of health and wellness, I don't think he would come to it from a position of kind of trying to show me the science, so to speak. It was more, hey, this is what I'm doing, and look, if you're interested, this is why. But it was kind of just teeing me up for my own kind of journey to deep dive it. But as I said, I was very skeptical, and I do remember saying to him many times that I'm not sure if what he was doing was a good idea.
Mm. Okay, so then a lot of people would, decide, okay, I'm going to read a few books about this, or I'm going to watch a documentary or listen to some podcasts. You decide to go to master's. You can get your master's in nutrition, which is
Mm-hmm.
going above and beyond to understand this. What was it that propelled you to go that far with it?
Mm-hmm.
Did you
Well,
not like physical therapy and physiology
mm-hmm.
and all of that? Are you thinking about career shift?
So it wasn't that I immediately enrolled in a master's in nutrition science. What I did do to begin with was go into the peer-reviewed literature. So in my undergraduate
Mhm.
degree, I did honors, and that involved actually conducting my own study and writing it up and learning about study design and methodology, results, and a little bit of data analyzing, and then coming to your own discussion and conclusion. So I had some skills to kind of read peer-reviewed science, but very quickly going in and looking at nutrition science without any formal training in that, I realized that it's a whole different beast, and I didn't have the necessary skills to actually make sense of it. And I mentioned before that if you look in the media or you just look online, you can see people that have both maybe have MD after their name, but come to very, very different conclusions. And so I was at that stage. I was kind of in a position where I feel like a lot of people are, where they're just very confused, and you kind of just throw your hands up in the air and think, well, nobody's got this worked out. And I think that, and like frustration, there was frustration at that point. I I think that is what sort of inspired me. I had to kind of get the skills at my end so that I could actually start to make sense of nutrition science and understand what a healthy diet looked like. And to answer your question as to whether I was kind of bored of physiotherapy or not, I love physiotherapy. I think it's a fantastic profession. I had so many great memories there, and really great learnings that set me up for what I'm doing today. But I did feel like there was this huge gap in my understanding of health, and even in those football club environments, when when it came to nutrition, it just seemed like there was a very cookie cutter approach. All players were doing the same thing. There wasn't any talk of evidence. And so, yeah, I kind of had this brewing curiosity to go away and learn this at a deeper level, and then hopefully become a kind of more rounded health professional.
Can we talk a little bit about those differences? You said that nutrition studies, that was a different beast. How was that different based on study design and methodology?
Yeah. So there are so many moving parts when it comes to our diet that I think people can appreciate. And if I say to you, hey, Light, is red meat good or bad? Right. Well, in what dietary pattern? For who? How old are they? What exposure level? And when I say what exposure level, I mean, are we talking about 50 grams a week, 50 grams a day, 200 grams a week, 200 grams a day? How long for? And compared to what? Are we talking about red meat compared to a Mars bar? Are we talking about red meat compared to whole grains? Are we talking about red meat compared to legumes? Are we talking about red meat compared to fish? And so I think you can start to appreciate right now that there are so many studies out there. And unless you get into those and really understand the parameters of those studies, it can be, you can quickly come to the wrong conclusions. And so an example of this would be, let's say I want to look at I'm going to use a vegan diet here because I think this illustrates an important point. Let's say I find a study that shows a vegan diet improves health markers, and let's say we're talking about things like blood pressure and cholesterol. Now, quite often that study might make headlines. Now, a really important question to ask there was, compared to what? Did they just compare a vegan diet to a standard American diet, what we would call a dummy diet that basically anything can beat? And a lot of times that's the case. Now you might think, well, you don't need to go to university to learn that, but I'm giving you a very simple example of essentially just needing to understand the art of nutrition science, how these studies are being conducted, so that when you're reading them, you can be aware of these things. Another example would be, if you take a population of people, and let's say you're trying to work out, how does red meat affect someone's health outcomes? And we take a population of people and we track them for 20 years. Now, if we find an association, people that eat more red meat have more heart attacks, an important question to sort of think about there is, well, what else do people that eat more red meat do? Do they drink more alcohol? Do they exercise less? Do they smoke more? Are they of lower socioeconomic status or higher? Do they have different education levels? All of these other things that we know also correlate with health outcomes. And so what I would be looking for in a study now that is, say, looking at that particular question is, did they use what's called a multivariate statistical analysis to adjust for these, what we call confounding variables? And what a confounding variable means, people will hear this, is essentially in a particular study, we're looking at an exposure. So in that example, red meat, and an outcome. And let's say the outcome is heart attacks. A confounding variable is any other kind of variable that could be affecting that outcome, like smoking or alcohol or these other factors. And when we, in a good cohort, which is that kind of study I've explained there of a population, often that's called epidemiology or observational science. In a good study, the researchers will consider what are the possible confounding variables. And you can imagine, like, in order to actually adjust for those, that means that when you're actually collecting data, you have to ask the questions. You have to find out. And then again, how good that adjustment is depends on how good your questions are. Did you just ask people, do you drink or not? Or did you try and find out, do people drink on average 1 drink a day, 2 drinks a day, 3 drinks a day? Did you just ask if people smoke or not? Or did you find out if they have 20 cigarettes a week or 10 or 5? And how well defined your population is in terms of all of these parameters will affect how well you can adjust for these confounding variables. All of that can sound confusing. The point of that is the better the data and the better that statistical adjustment, the more certain, or the more confident, I should say, we can be that our finding is an accurate reflection of that exposure and how that exposure affects that outcome.
So when you're reading a study, unless a layperson is reading a study, do they clearly state that this study involved a multivariate statistical analysis? Is that like a standardized classification where they're the same 200 metrics to make sure that they accounted for all of these different confounding variables?
Yes, and you'll see it in the method section. In the method section, there'll be a particular section for statistical analysis, which will describe exactly what I just went through. And then usually when they show the results, which go through, and again, in order to read the results, I mean, you could sort of self-train, but a lot of that I've learned through doing my master's. You're looking at data and effect sizes and confidence intervals and a lot of, it's another language. But underneath that table of those results will show these different what we call adjustment models, and that is the multivariate analysis. And I kind of went into quite a surface level example there. It does go a lot deeper depending on the study and depending on what exposure and outcome they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously put a lot of studies in your book later, and I'm not sure if you knew you were ever going to write a book in these earlier days. Were you like, did you have when I first started getting into meditation and I knew that I was going to become a teacher one day, I had a binder. And every time I came across an inspirational story or just something that I thought that really resonated with me, I would store it away in my little binder. And so at some point, my binder would have hundreds of pages of different stories and anecdotes and different teachings. Did you have an equivalent of that when you were studying all of this? And what did that look like?
It was online. And that was probably just to kind of, I was printing quite a few papers at the beginning, but then they start to stack up like my dad. And I thought, I can't do this. I'm not inheriting this habit. So I mean, I'm so thankful. Like from the beginning, I set up a kind of online database of studies as I'd go through them, and I would categorize them. So I'd categorize them kind of broadly by the area of health or health outcome, if it's cardiovascular disease or dementia or cancer, and then within there start subcategories. So I do have this kind of catalog of studies or archive that I can go back to at any moment. But yeah, you're right. I didn't think I was going to write a book. I was doing that just so that I could retrieve this information quite quickly if I needed to.
So one of the big phrases from the whole pandemic era was, there'd be some online argument or conflict, and then someone will say, you need to go do your research. And you talk about that in your book, this whole idea of doing your research. And it's not as simple if you properly doing research based on what we just talked about, but it sounds like you were actually doing proper research. Talk about that. Talk about why it's not so easy to do your research.
Well, for many of the kind of things we've been through so far with regards to understanding the details of a study, and I guess zooming back out, first appreciating that there is an evidence hierarchy, and so we have this sort of pyramid that helps us kind of categorize different types of science by less reliable and less valid to more reliable, more valid. And the very bottom of that is kind of expert opinion. If someone just says something, that's not very valid or reliable unless they're pointing to a study. But in that case, we're thinking about the study. And then, a rung above that, you have your kind of laboratory type studies. They could be on animals or in a petri dish on cells. Again, not very reliable or valid for extrapolating to humans. And we know that. We actually know that the translation of that research it's a very low percentage of what we see at that level that translates to humans. And then a step above that is your kind of population studies where you're looking at people out in the wild and you're trying your best to adjust for these confounding variables. And, that's how we worked out that smoking's not a great idea. It's through those studies, right? So often people say, well, these population studies, there's so many confounding variables, but we just have to appreciate that it's not feasible to run a clinical intervention for everything. Can you imagine if right now I said, well, like, for smoking, I want to randomize people into a smoking group and a non-smoking group, and I want to track them for 60 plus years. And in order to kind of get to that position to want to do that study, first, I've seen, say, 7,000 observational studies that tell me there's a strong correlation between smoking and cancer. It's not going to pass an ethics board to randomize people to smoking when we have that much observational evidence that it's not a good idea, first and foremost. But then you can imagine that there's all sorts of adherence issues. It's so expensive to run a randomized controlled trial for that long. So the observational studies are a really important piece of the puzzle. They help us explore questions that we can't explore with clinical interventions. Now, certainly clinical interventions are more robust in that they allow us to control for these kind of confounding variables better. The idea with the clinical intervention, a randomized controlled trial, is that the only difference between the two groups, because you've done a random allocation, is the exposure that you're looking at. So if we were to have two groups that let's say adopt different diets and we do a randomized controlled trial, we would expect that the background incidence of, say, alcohol and smoking and exercise and everything else is the same. And in fact, after they do a randomization, the researchers will check that and make sure that that randomization was actually random and those kind of, there was no differences in those baseline characteristics. So understanding that evidence hierarchy would be an important first step if someone's going to kind of quote unquote do their own research. And then getting into each of the individual studies and looking at the methodology, some of those things that I mentioned before about compared to what exposure amount, what population, thinking about all of these things, looking at the data analysis. Is there an appropriate adjustment for confounding factors? And you can really, I think, begin to appreciate that this is a specialty and it can be very hard for someone to do if this is not the area that you're trained in, which goes for many different careers in life. We wouldn't kind of expect someone who's not trained in, say, finance to kind of just go in and do all of their accounting in a sophisticated business. This is kind of one of the reasons why when I see do your own research online, just kind of posted or pasted, it worries me a little bit, because I think that it makes it out as if it's quite a simple process, and it's not. It's complicated. I'm still learning every single day and improving and realizing things that I didn't have right, and updating the way that I'm looking at science. And this is one of the reasons why I think that the kind of top journal guidelines are a really good first step for people. like the Journal of or the American College of Cardiology, for example, or the European Atherosclerosis Society. They produce guidelines, for example, for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, and they have a committee of folks that are trained in research, and they all have different personal diets, and they come together and they sit down and evaluate all of the literature using the evidence hierarchy, getting into the details of the methodology, and coming to evidence-based recommendations for the public. So I often think that that's probably a better use of time for most people that are kind of wanting to get a quick snapshot of, hey, there's all this noise out there and it's quite confusing. I just want to understand what I should eat, and I want it to come from a reliable source. That's often where I point people.
Final question for you. Word on the street is that you're a very successful businessman. You have a restaurant. You obviously have a very successful podcast. And I'm curious, how have your markers for success changed over the years? How are you currently defining success for yourself? Is it in book sales? Is it in how many people are inspired by you to change their diet or upgrade their diet? Or how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I wish I had a tangible metric. I probably previously was a bit more focused on the tangible things. And this might sound airy fairy, but for me today, and one of the pillars of my new updated show, there's 6 pillars, but one of them is align. And and I'm talking about alignment here. And I think that as I've gotten older, I've been able to kind of better understand how aligned I am in terms of my my daily actions and how aligned they are with my values. And when there's some discordance there, things just don't feel right. So in terms of kind of evaluating my success now, I see my success as being able to continue my passions and do what I love in alignment with my value set. And I'm not interested in boosting some sort of number on a piece of paper or the bank account if it is out of whack with that. So I'm certainly not against making money. I think it's important and should not be shunned. But I want to feel that I'm doing that in a way where I'm also representing my value set. And I think that my approach with a lot of this is to embody what I say and to lead by example. And I do think that speaking generally, one of the best ways to influence people around you is certainly to actually live by your values and be a walking, living proof example of that. So, I certainly don't get that right all the time. And there's internal dialogue about, okay, you're thinking about doing this or this, but your values here, it doesn't quite feel that right. And I know that you would know this feeling. We all have it. And you kind of think about, well, what can I do to close that gap? And as you start to close that gap, life feels easier. It feels more peaceful. And, this is not something that I appreciated in my early 20s. I was just full steam, head down. And I don't know, maybe ignorance is bliss. But now that I think about all of this stuff a lot more, I'm just certainly more conscious of keeping that peace, which all starts with those actions.
What's interesting is you can't really adjust the values. You almost always have to adjust your actions, which makes it so difficult sometimes.
Well, you can try to adjust you can do some mental gymnastics and try and adjust your values. But the problem
Right.
is, and I do that, but then I'm conscious of the fact that I'm doing that, and
Right.
it doesn't feel right.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.